Welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Sarah Sassoon, and I'm the editor-in-chief of SAIS Perspectives, the student-run publication of the International Development Program. Our aim is to provide SAIS students, faculty, staff, alumni, and members of the broader community with a platform to share their ideas about the most pressing issues in international development. We publish articles and blogs drawn from contributors' academic, professional, and field experiences. However, we equally value the power of photographs to tell stories, and that is why our photo contest is a staple of each annual edition. After our panel discussion, you are all invited to view the winning photographs on display in the back of the auditorium and to speak with the photographers about the context behind each shot. The images you will see remind us that being a development policymaker or practitioner requires more than an extensive CV. It requires the ability to empathize, to connect, to communicate, to get intimate. These characteristics are especially salient in approaching the theme that we have selected for this year's edition, climate change and international development. We chose this theme because climate change is among the most urgent challenges that every living being faces today. Developing countries are particularly vulnerable to the ramifications of environmental pressures. Issues of food security and forced migration have become even more pertinent in the face of changing ecosystems. Often perceived as an almost insurmountable feat, solving this problem will require people everywhere to exercise empathy, connection, communication, and intimacy. We hope to encourage healthy debate and innovative solutions from our readers and contributors, since we believe that education and discussion are what engender impactful action. I'd now like to take a moment to thank the people who made this event possible. First and foremost, thank you to the International Development Department, home to the Journal, and without which we would not exist. A special thank you to our faculty advisor and director of IDEV, Professor Tanvi Nagpal, to Ada Ho, IDEV Program Coordinator, and to Nicole Kazi, IDEV Program Assistant, for your undying support and insight. To everyone who contributed to the photo contest, participants and winners alike, we appreciate you sharing your stories and providing us a window into your wild travels and adventures. And to our honored panelists, we are so grateful that you are here to share your passion and knowledge on an issue that touches each and every person in this room. Finally, I'd like to introduce the winner of this year's photo contest, Logan Ma. His photo, Afternoon on the Ubayan Bridge, was taken in Myanmar. This year's contest solicited submissions from 49 contributors and represented 39 different countries, including North Korea. We thank you all for sharing your work with us. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Logan to share his story.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. As a child, circumstances limited my opportunities to see the world. 3 years before my birth, my parents immigrated from China to Utah after Tiananmen with only a single suitcase. To make ends meet, they waited diner tables, cleaned motel rooms, and when time allowed, endured the long bus ride to Nevada to staff the Carson City blackjack tables. Travel was a luxury, reserved only for the occasional visit to Grandma's house. One day, my father found a dusty stack of National Geographic magazines at a garage sale. In those days of scarcity, before the advent of social media, let alone the internet, the images in those iconic yellow bordered issues became my window into the wider world. I met some of my idols while sifting through those pages, masters of imagery who created visual spectacles in distant lands far from the confines of our tiny apartment. As I grew older, I found myself especially drawn to those who use photography to convey stories about the world around us. Legends like Steve McCurry, whose haunting portrait of the Afghan girl captured the human toll warfare, and Dorothea Lange, whose migrant mother became an iconic representation of the Great Depression. For these giants, photography was not merely art for art's sake, but a means to effect social change by emphasizing issues otherwise removed from the public conscious. Photojournalists shape the ways in which we view the world. They are uniquely placed to draw attention to what the human eye cannot or will not see. Their work gives credence to the ageless adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. In times like these, when trust in media institutions is at an all-time low, when demagogues and dictators twist words, dismiss facts, and perpetuate outright lies, photographs have the power to sear an irrefutable truth into the collective conscience. This power is more relevant than ever in the face of global climate change. Numbers and figures may communicate scientific facts, but these alone are insufficient. A picture persuades at a more visceral level. One can choose to deny climate change, but cannot unsee images of barren rocks where once stood majestic glaciers or vibrant villages obliterated by wildfires. When I captured this picture of Myanmar's Yupen Bridge, I was merely a traveler passing by. All around me, people went about their daily lives, monks on their way to pray, families returning from the market, fishermen casting their nets. Little did I know that before my eyes, the effects of climate change were already taking place. Looking back, I was not in a boat when I took this picture, but rather standing on a dry lake bed no more than 20 feet away from the bridge. This would have been perfectly normal in the dry season, but at that time the wet season was well underway. Yet the waters were nowhere near as high as they should have been. In hindsight, the monsoon rains were late. Few countries match Myanmar in terms of vulnerability to climate change. In the larger region around the Yupen Bridge, once predictable rainfall is now a thing of the past, wreaking havoc on local livelihoods as farmers struggle to fill water reserves and make ends meet. Should this trend continue, the outcomes will be catastrophic. This is a reality of living with climate change. Unless we take action, serene scenes like this one on the Yupen Bridge will be only a distant memory, a reminder of what once existed. Thank you.
Thanks, Logan. I'd now like to welcome our panelists to the stage. Our first panelist is Jessica Fanzo, who is the Director of Global Food Ethics and Policy Program at Johns Hopkins, and whom I've been fortunate enough to have as my professor this semester. The second is Carter Brandon, a Senior Fellow for the Global Commission on Adaptation at the World Resources Institute, and the former Global Lead Economist for Environment, Natural Resources, and Climate Change at the World Bank. The third is Devin Cohn, who is a Senior Advocate for Women and Girls at Refugees International. And finally, our moderator is Shamaila Chaudhry, President of the American Pakistan Foundation and a Fellow at SAIS's Foreign Policy Institute. We are so grateful to have you all here. Thank you.
Unless you want to. If you want to, you can. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, panelists are welcome to speak from the podium or speak from chairs. It's up to you, whatever you prefer.
No, sitting's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you to the IDEV program and Sarah and everyone that put in work to organize this. This is actually one of my favorite events at SAIS. I've been fortunate to be affiliated with SAIS for the past 6 years, and when I found out there was a photography exhibit, I went nuts because I am a student of international affairs myself, and my background is in Afghanistan and Pakistan policy. But later in my life, I became a photographer, and I found that I learned more about the impact of the policies I worked on through the photography that I was observing after I had left government, in particular looking at the stories of all the veterans that were coming back from the war in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, and looking at the impact of the conflicts on their personal lives, which is not something we study in policy at all. And so I felt like I became smarter and more, I had more empathy and I looked at issues in a more comprehensive way. So today's event actually makes a very strong case for a cross-disciplinary, intersectional education, which is very much in practice here at SAIS. So with that, I'd like to just start the discussion. We're going to be looking at the impact of climate change on a variety of international development issues. So this is a good crash course on kind of applying climate change in a variety of ways. So we'll first go to Jess Fanzo, who will talk about the relationship between climate change and food security.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you all for coming and for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. So over the last 50 years, our food systems, our diets have changed really substantially. Agriculture has really focused on improving crop productivity, ensuring that we can feed the world. And because of that, we've been quite remarkable in reducing hunger, improving life expectancy, falling infant and child mortality, and decreasing global poverty. However, the health benefits now are being offset by these global shifts to unhealthy diets that are high in calories, very overly processed, and more demand of animal source foods. So these trends are being driven by urbanization, wealth, increasing incomes, inadequate access to some health services, but also population, et cetera. So there's all these drivers that are influencing these shifts. And the shift towards unhealthy diets, it's not only increasing the burden of obesity and diet-related non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, but it's also contributing to environmental degradation. So when we look at the international community, it's really taken a lot of steps over the last few decades to reduce hunger and improve nutrition. We had the Millennium Development Goals, now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. But we still have a lot of undernutrition in the world. We have hunger. Hunger's going up. We now have 821 million people who go to bed hungry every night. We still have 20% of the world's children under the age of 5 who are chronically undernourished or stunted. And then compounding this, we have 2.1 billion people who are overweight and obese. So the prevalence of these diseases, the malnutrition burden associated with the unhealthy diets is really debilitating for the global society. And a lot of this does fall on the diets. Diets are now the #1 risk factor of disease, disability, and death in the world. More than air pollution, more than tobacco smoking, more than drinking. It's our diets, these unhealthy diets. Low in fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds, high in salt, sugar, fats, processed meats, overly processed packaged junk food. And in addition to the impacts on morbidity and mortality, these diets are also having their environmental toll, environmental degradation. So they're really sort of a lose-lose scenario when it comes time to diets. And what we know is that diets are born from food systems. Food systems are producing our food, they're moving our food, they're processing our food and selling our food. And food production is the largest cause of global environmental change now. Agriculture occupies about 40% of global land. It is responsible for, you see the numbers, 17 to 25% of greenhouse gases and 70% of fresh water use. We're seeing a lot of conversion of natural ecosystems and pastures to agriculture, causing species to be threatened or go extinct. I'm really going to depress all of you right now. Also, the environmental burden from food production includes marine systems. About 60% of the world's fish stocks are fully fished, more than 30% overfished. And the marine fisheries have been declining since the 1960s. So agriculture, the agriculture sector is really contributing to the environmental degradation. And food systems are not only an instigator of climate change, but they're a victim of climate change. So we are really at a moment in time where we're going to have to feed 10 billion people in a healthy and sustainable way. And how are we going to do it when our food systems are starting to fail? So we need to transform the food system very quickly. If you think in a business as usual approach, we're going to hit 1.5 by 2030. Well, 1.5 degree world. By 2050, a 2 degree world. And the world's going to look very different. The natural earth systems will begin to take over, and we no longer are in control. So we really have 1.5 decades to make big changes if we want to address climate change. Food system changes will be a part of that. There's been a lot of reports in the last 6 months talking about the food systems and climate. Food systems were kind of off the agenda in the climate talks. It was mainly about energy and transportation. But now food is central. People are realizing its deep relationship with climate. We had the Eat Lancet Commission. We had the IPCC report on land and food. We had the Food and Land Use Coalition report. We had the World Resources Institute report, Sustainable Food Futures. We've had all of these reports talking about, describing the dire situation that we're in over the next 2 decades, but more importantly, about the many solutions that are available now where we can take action. Not only changing diets to those that are of lower footprint, more plant-based diets. Some of you have probably tried some of these plant-based proteins like Impossible Burger, et cetera. But it's also changing agriculture production practices. Sorry, I've been like going for 24 hours straight giving talks in 3 cities. Also talking about sustainable agriculture practices that are available now, using better technologies, decreased deforestation, biodiversity protection, and reducing food loss and waste. All of these sort of transformations have been recommended in all of these reports at different conferences. And it's using all of the technologies and knowledge that we have in hand now. So it's going to take a vast number of actors to make behavior changes. Governments, private sector, the food and beverage industry, producers, and citizens. And while it may seem daunting with the time scale that we have to work within, one thing humans have proven is that with political will, creativity, and innovation, we can bend that arc. We can really make changes, and we can do them fast to save ourselves and the planet. So I think this year is the decisive year for food. We're seeing a lot of big initiatives around oceans and land use type coalitions that the UN is spearheading. There's going to be a UN Food Summit in 2021. The Secretary General has announced that. That'll take place in the early part of 2021, and that's going to be all about climate and food. And there's talk of a new intergovernmental panel of climate change, the IPCC, which comes out every 5 years, one for food, because there's a lot of confusion around the evidence of food and climate. So there's talk of developing an IPCC for food in the next couple of years. So there's a lot of excitement in the space, but we've got a very short time window to do something about it. And I'll end there.
Thank you. That was very depressing.
I thought he ended positively.
But we actually knew that if it has the words climate change in it, it's going to be depressing. However, you did end it in a very positive note, and I have some follow-up questions which we'll rotate through after the rest of the panelists have spoken. So Devin has a very illustrious resume of work on refugees and migration. So she will talk about how climate change displacement relates to forced migration and protection issues.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I just wanted to talk, like Shamila said, about the way that climate change affects forced migration and displacement worldwide, and then what that means for people's protection in individual lives, because that is certainly the work that I do. So I'm going to go through my remarks by posing a series of questions, and then I'll get to some of the protection issues that I see in the course of my work. So the first question I want to pose is, when did we as an international community first realize that that the current climate change has a significant effect on mass displacement. When was that determined, and when do people start talking about that? And is that new? Because we're certainly talking about it now. But I'm also going to be quite depressing, and not to get off onto too negative of a start, but we have known about some of the biggest trends in migration as it relates to climate change for a long time. And to be honest, since before many of you were born, and maybe you were young kids. But as early as 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, as she mentioned, noted that the greatest single impact on climate change would possibly be human migration. And millions of people have already been displaced by climate change, but certainly that will continue. And so we've had 30 years to talk about this and address this. But at least in the field that I work in, this has kind of just started. So the organization I work for, Refugees International, started a climate displacement program 10 years ago, which was pretty novel in the field of legal protection for refugees and people forcibly displaced. So while the scientific evidence, which I'm not certainly an expert in, but the scientific evidence of climate change is clear, and we're becoming more and more confident in it, the consequences of climate change on migration is very unclear. And those consequences are unclear, and they're not predictable because there's so many other factors that relate to why people move and when they move. Social, economic factors, environmental factors, political factors, all sorts of things. So what we do know is that most of the studies estimate that the number of people who will be forced to move for a long period of time, not temporary displacement, but as a direct result of climate change, will be about 200 million in 2050. So just to put that in perspective, what I work on generally, refugees and internally displaced people, IDPs, that generally I work on the issues of people that are displaced by persecution or war. But certainly more and more we're working on issues of people displaced, particularly internally, by climate change and by natural disasters as a result of, and linked to climate change. So right now, for refugees and internally displaced people by persecution and war, there's about 70 million. So 70 million is a huge number. You hear it all the time, how this is unprecedented, and yet 200 million, more than double that for 2050, and add that to what we already have as refugees and IDPs from other causes. And so, to put that in more perspective, in 2050, 1 out of every 45 people in the world will have been displaced by climate change. So certainly, the other issue, I think one of the big issues, is that the burden or the responsibility, I don't like to call it a burden, but the responsibility of providing for and hosting and dealing with people that are displaced by climate change will be borne by the poorest countries. And that is the same as political refugees and refugees from war, because many of the conflicts we have are the neighboring countries is really who are hosting refugees from conflict, and certainly the poorest countries are going to have the most responsibility for people displaced by climate because, and they're least equipped to deal with it really. And so, it's just a big challenge that we need to address, and we need to address cooperatively as an international community. So as this group, I believe, as SAIS Perspectives is focused on international development, I wanted to highlight that according to IOM, which I work with a lot, the International Organization of Migration, quote, forced migration hinders development in at least 4 ways: by increasing pressure on urban infrastructure and services, by undermining economic growth, by increasing the risk of conflict, which again is often my focus, and by leading to worse health, educational, and social indicators amongst migrants themselves. So while we know this, we've really ignored the scale of the problem so far. Because people forcibly displaced by climate change really fall through the cracks of what is out there for protection for people displaced and forcibly displaced. So the international refugee and immigration policies that we have don't account for people displaced by climate. And that's a key gap. And I think that that's the gap, again, that I see and focus on most most, because I think that I work on protection, and certainly the only way people can really be protected is if they have legal rights, and often the legal rights that come with displacement from climate change just aren't there. So related to that, what do we call someone who has been forced to move because of climate? This is a very sensitive and topic that's debated a lot, but that's the point. It's being debated because while often news articles and perhaps even gatherings and discussions talk about climate refugees, in fact, legally speaking, there's no such thing. And the reason I say that is that a person who is termed and deemed and labeled as a refugee really has to have crossed an international border, which many climate people displaced by climate change don't. And they also have to be persecuted for one of 5 reasons, and be unable to go back to their country, and also be not be protected by their own country. So there's a lot of distinctions that are particular to refugees that come with legal rights, or usually they come with legal rights unless the countries are not willing to respect those. So basically, I think that's a huge issue. So the labels do matter. I think that's important to note. They're important because, like I said, the terminology used has very real implications and obligations under international law and the international community. So basically, refugees are to be a refugee, you have to meet the definition of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, or the 1967 Protocol. That's a bit wonky. You can look those up, but the point being is that people that are displaced by climate often do not meet those criteria. So the other problem with a couple other problems with using the term refugee is that, like I said, they have to cross the international border, which often people displaced by climate don't. There's also an implication that if you are a refugee, you'll have the ability to return, and many people displaced by climate don't have a place to return to. And then finally, there is a concern that by expanding the notion of what a refugee is, it'll water down the protections for refugees that are fleeing conflict or persecution. So that is, again, certainly the debate is, do we open up the definition and risk losing protections that are already under threat, or do we find some other way to provide legal rights for people that are displaced by conflict? But the real point is we can call people displaced by climate various different things, but the one term that we really can't use accurately is climate change refugees. There's a lot of other things to say, and I think some of the panelists might go into that, or we can certainly answer questions about that. But moving on quickly, I don't know quite how much time I have, but you can let me know. But the problem and the issue with not being covered by a legal definition internationally is that, and not having an accepted definition of what we call and what's the definition of someone displaced by climate, is that unless people are relocated by extreme weather events, these long-term changes and movements of people really don't trigger any access to financial grants or aid, or like I said, protections or food aid, or additional measures to protect and assist people. So that relocation becomes very challenging and with its own risks. So the next question I have for myself and for these remarks is, does climate change exacerbate the extent of the refugee crisis as well? And I was just talking to someone before the panel about this, and how there is a theory of climate change known as the risk multiplier. But basically what that means is that natural disasters such as droughts and floods and all of these issues destabilize what are already shaky political situations and peace processes, and they can trigger other wars or other conflicts. And many of the conflicts that you note refugees flee from often have undertones of conflict over resources and limited resources and water rights and land rights, and there's all sorts of things that relate to climate change and how people are having to move and deal with the changes in the environment. So, and I think of places like that we work in. I was just in South Sudan, and in South Sudan, certainly, there's a lot of food insecurity, 7 million people, and also there's issues of other climate-related issues that exacerbate what is already a very fragile peace process, and they've had conflict for decades. So instead of focusing on the definition of who can access asylum and can people displaced by climate do so, I think we need to focus on the protection of people that do flee because of climate change. And so I will just go into, I'm going to skip a little bit, but what I'll go into is the protection risks that people that are displaced face, because that is really what I focus on. And because I focus on women and girls in my current role, I think it's really important to note that people displaced, whether it be by war, conflict, persecution, or climate change, inevitably they are at greater risk for exploitation. And certainly women and girls are disproportionately face this and are disproportionately affected by displacement itself. So, when people move and are forced to move, it puts them at disproportionate risk, especially women, of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse and trafficking, which is, again, what I focus on a lot. And so I think that, these are really the human costs of what we're seeing. And it's related to the breakdown of infrastructure and rule of law and the fracturing of social structures and really the desperate need of assistance during the process of forced displacement. And like I said, because there's not a legal definition, people that are displaced by climate don't necessarily have those built-in protections or assistance or aid that others might have. So there's a lot of desperation. In these situations I've learned of and talked to people that have dealt with spikes in rape and assault and forced prostitution and forced and early marriage and survival sex and trading sex for humanitarian aid, all of these things that relate to displacement more generally, but certainly as the numbers increase with people displaced due to climate change, these issues will only increase. So the last two things I'll say is that through my work and through the work of many others in this space of protection of displaced people and certainly women and girls, no matter what is reported or recorded, these harms that I mentioned towards women and girls, 100% of the time increase in forced displacement and in post-disaster settings. 100% of the time that is, these harms increase and exploitation increases, and sometimes it's reported and there's mechanisms to report it and refer people for assistance, and sometimes there's not. So I think it's important to look at climate displacement with a gendered perspective, and we as an international community and together with local context-specific organizations need to recognize these realities and be prepared to deal with them on a much grander scale due to migration, or a much grander scale as migration due to climate change increases, as I mentioned. So that's certainly what we're looking at in my organization and many others, and trying to figure out how we can, with these large numbers, but also with this unclear, the lack of clarity of data and all the different factors that cause people to move, how we can really focus on protection and focus on protection of the most vulnerable that are moving.
Thank you, Devin. I think based on what Jess and Devin had said, it reinforces the idea that there's no one path towards addressing climate change's impacts, and it requires a lot of collaboration across sectors and different communities of decision makers. And so it's a good segue to turn to Carter, who will talk about a recent report of the World Resources Institute that looks into kind of the problem-solving angle of it.
Great, thanks very much. And both of you have provided sort of perfect segues to what I've been working on. So I've been working with something called the Global Commission on Adaptation. And focus on the word commission for a minute. What is it? It's about 30 prominent people who have come together from rich countries, poor countries, public sector, private sector, politically left, politically right, to basically elevate the issue of adaptation. And why? Because we all recognize that mitigation, carbon emissions reduction is paramount, and we have to do absolutely as much as we can. But we haven't done enough. Impacts are upon us. The lock-in effects for even future and worse impacts over the future are upon us, and so we just have to do something about the adaptation side as well. So who are these people? Well, there's 3 co-chairmen of this commission. One's Bill Gates, so I'll talk about food a little bit because through the Gates Foundation, very much involved in agriculture. One is Kristalina Georgieva, who used to be the CEO of the World Bank until last month, and now she's the managing director of the IMF. And the third is Ban Ki-moon, ex-Secretary General of the UN. And the other commissioners are heads of state, heads of donor agencies, heads of NGOs, et cetera, heads of private companies, pension funds, all that. So I guess I have 3 stories, and one for each of you, and then one of my own. But let's start with Bill Gates. And well, actually, let's start with the social issues broadly, which you certainly touched upon, and migration is one risk multiplier for a whole, cascading effect of social issues. So Michelle Bachelet is one of our commissioners, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, and she was saying you absolutely have to make human rights one of the fundamental principles of your report. Okay, other primarily NGO leaders, Oxfam, Slum International, et cetera, said, no, you really have to make gender issues fundamental to this report, but not just gender, but also the most vulnerable people. And the message was, this is not about technology. This is not about a fix of policies. This is not about economists like myself providing incentives. This is about power. This is about how resources are allocated, how decisions are made, how the money flows to the local level. Okay, great message. On the other hand, we have Bill Gates, who said, this is not about power. This is about technology and putting money into agricultural research and making the lives of people on the front line. And I can tell you, his view was, sure, we care about hundreds of thousands of people in the South Pacific Islands. That's really important. But what we really care about are the hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia in particular, whose livelihoods will be decimated by climate change. Okay, they don't have resources, they don't have the right research, they don't have the right extension. You can go down the list of problems: finance, technology, extension, infrastructure, education. Where do you start? And the Gates view is you start with lots of interventions as quickly as possible because we don't have time. The other extreme, you need social change at a massive scale. So where does a commission like mine come in? We don't say, frankly, it's about power. Some of us may believe it, some may not, but we don't have a concrete recommendation for the next 2 to 3 years on how to change power relationships across sub-Saharan Africa, even though we're familiar with the issues. We can't even say it's a fundamental human rights issue. As much as Michelle Bachelet would like to say it, I'm sorry, the climate COPs and the negotiations have kicked around human rights extensively. In the Paris Agreement, you can read what it says about human rights, and it demands that countries basically respect their own laws. That's as far as they can go. So there's no universal principle that we could hang our hat on. So okay, that's kind of a general story about social. We're all pushing every lever we can, but the messaging we think is kind of important. And I'll get to the final messages in a minute. On food, well, I sort of said that Bill Gates was super involved, but Bill Gates pledged $300 billion and said, nothing we need more than agricultural research, and then other, because we have commissioners from the UK, we have commissioners from Canada, we have commissioners from other countries. They've laid on. So when we announced this report last month, we had $900 million of incremental money to pledge for agricultural research for subsistence farmers in the world with a particular focus on resilience. Okay, that's great. Where do you start? Bill Gates and his team says, well, you start with the CG system, because they do, if you know the CGIAR system, 20-some centers, all the different crops, all the different parts of the world. Okay, it's a great place to start. Is it enough? I personally don't think so. They're a little bit sleepy, they're a little bit old, they're undergoing a massive reform process, and they can do great stuff. But they don't have a monopoly on innovation or technology or extension or whatever, so we're using this commission to broaden that thing, the donation and the resources and the recommendations. Okay, so those are the first two stories. The third story is where does this commission come out on what are we saying? And we've had commissioner meetings in May, in July, and then the launch of the report. So frankly, over the course of this 6-month process, I was the lead author, didn't have much of a summer. We wrote 3 different reports. The first report we wrote for May basically said, damn, climate change is a real problem. We need a report that is emphatic. In fact, we had a report that said, you need to adapt now because you can't wait, and there's huge benefits in early action. We need to involve, I think, just as you said, what did you say, a vast number of actors. We need to adapt everywhere because it's not just the poor countries, it's the rich countries. It's the mayor of Miami, by the way, is one of our commissioners. I don't know how many of you know Florida politics. He's a Republican. Okay, what is he going to say about this? He says, I'm a pragmatist. Of course Miami has to do something about climate change. Other mayors of Florida got together last week and they said, wow, we just had a lost decade, and what a silly thing that was. But now they're sort of addressing it. So we, the message was we have to adapt now, we have to adapt everywhere, and we have to adapt fairly, because it's also about, I think as one of you said, the poorest are the most vulnerable, the most impacted, the least resourceful, the least beneficiary of safety nets, of financial insurance, you name it, they're the most impacted. So we came up with this messaging of now, everywhere, fairly. And then we decided, the commissioners decided, just to be emphatic isn't good enough. Yeah, you can push rah, 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 but you have to tell people why. So the next report had the message, basically, well, good adaptation is good development, and vice versa. Good development is good adaptation. You cannot separate. There's lots of climate finance out there. There's a lot of institutions that are all about incrementality. They're all about the difference between development as usual, and then we overlay climate. And from our view in the world of adaptation, it's just wrong, because you wouldn't develop in any other area if there's a risk that you know about and call about something differently. You would say this is your core strategy and how you develop it, and you have to manage risk, you have to manage uncertainty, you don't know all the impacts, you have to understand that simply because we don't know the impacts you have to adjust along the way, etc. So you have to develop better. And you have to plan for growth, you have to use the opportunities and minimize the cost, because if you adapt early, the costs are relatively low. So that was the second report. And then, so then we had another commissioner meeting, and everyone kicked around, and we had all these different points of view. And then for the third report, we actually came up with a different scenario again. So I'm just telling you through the process. The third and final, I have one copy here, by the way. It's in my bag. I'll give it to you or you, Sarah, but it's online, of course. We decided that we need to show the logic of acting in the 3-dimension, and we call it the 3 imperatives. The first imperative is the social imperative. It's about rights, without saying it's a universal principle, but it's about rights, poverty, equity, gender, minimizing migration, but where you have migration, also do it properly. It's not just a problem, it's also part of your toolkit of strategies to actually make the life of migrants better and diversify their knowledge so they can diversify maybe their income, etc. So the social imperative. Second one is an ecological imperative, that nature is so degraded and degrading, I think it's just touched on, that it nature itself cannot provide us with the resilience we need to address climate change. It also can't provide us with the sequestration we need to reduce emissions. And there is this massive double win-win on nature for adaptation, nature for mitigation, and by the way, nature for nature and all the other ecological services and biodiversity and the values that I'm sure everybody in this room shares, that the degradation is such that this is a strong priority. And then the third imperative, after social and ecological, was the economic imperative. Well, what does that mean? Well, we did a bunch of research. As I said, I'm an economist. We looked at what are the benefits of investing in adaptation. We looked at 5 different sectors. We looked at food, we looked at water, we looked at the environment, particularly in the case of coastal mangroves. We looked at infrastructure, which is the biggest ticket item. There's $90 trillion in infrastructure scheduled to be invested over the next 15 years. And we looked at the benefits of disaster risk management, particularly early warning systems. So using a cost-benefit framework, we looked at the rates of returns on these investments. Who's the audience for this? Primarily public sector governments, but not exclusively, because private sector is vulnerable to climate change in many ways. The returns on these investments average 5-to-1 benefit cost ratio, anywhere from 3 or 4 to, for the case of early warning, 10 to 12. So just for those of you who don't know cost benefit analysis, we're not talking about a 10, 15, 20% rate of return, which is what a company typically would want in return on investment. 15% would be fantastic. We're talking 200%, 300% returns on these investments in terms of what? Economic benefits, ecological benefits, social benefits. And we spell that out. We call it the triple dividends. This is not a world where the private sector and financial calculus can make all the decisions. We need to look at this more holistically. So that was the narrative of this final report, the 3 imperatives, and we talk about the rates of return, and then we go forward. It's got this front-end framing, which is just the first part. Then we have detailed chapters on what we call 6 systems or sectors, food, water, the natural environment, infrastructure, cities, and finance. And then we get into what this commission, these 30 prominent people, what they're willing to do over the next year, not stopping just for the report, but moving forward. And if we have time, I can talk about that a little bit, but it has to do with, I've touched a little bit on food. There's a lot going on in finance. There's a lot going on in local action. There's a lot going on in cities, et cetera. But it's the topic that cuts across, as you say, it requires a vast number of actors. And,
Thank you. So I have one follow-up question for any of you or all of you, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So it struck me that as we were talking, that we're focusing on a few particular phases of climate change and international development. One is this world of reports and commissions and meetings and chapters in which there's a lot of activity, and it's very inspiring. And focused mostly in this multilateral space as well as in nonprofits. But then there's the policy side, which we know can't be the solution alone. There's the policy side, and then there's a street game. You could add to that like climate change activism or advocacy. And so I'm just curious to hear your views on those 2 aspects, and specifically, what happens when a country like the United States has a government that denies climate science and actively is working towards denying it. Even at the same time, at the city level, at the local level, there's a lot of activity going on, as you mentioned, with the Republican mayor. So I'd just be interested in hearing your thoughts on that, because if you're saying that there are lots of stakeholders to engage with, then we should also think about the ones that are deliberately not engaging and how to manage those. So just anyone, it's a question for any of you, and then we can open it up.
well, I can jump in and say one thing, which is, yes, there are a lot of meetings, which is okay. I think education is a huge part of this. But part of our strategy to involve people who we absolutely need to involve and who are not. And what is that group? Generally are finance ministers and central bankers. Why? Because every country, if you know the climate negotiations, are preparing their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. This is often coordinated by either ministries of environment or ministries of foreign affairs. They're collecting great ideas from all the various what we call sector ministries. You know, what do we need in infrastructure? What do we need in water? What do we need in agriculture? And these things come, and who makes the final decisions on national priorities? Probably going to be the Minister of Finance. Got to approve the budget. Where's the money going? Also, the Minister of Finance has to do what the policies are for private sector investment. And we know that we need to bring in private investment to the extent possible. And we know the ministries of finance have to deal with the fiscal risk of climate change, which has to do with structuring the economy. So this group in general is kind of looking above what are the specific sectoral problems, which don't minimize at all. But we think this is an audience that we're bringing in. And there is a new coalition of finance ministers, again, chaired by Kristalina Georgieva and David Malpass had a meeting last Saturday. 50 countries are coming together, and we're being asked to uphold the adaptation dimension of what they learn and do. Because what have ministers of finance already heard about? Oh, they've heard about carbon taxes, they've heard about cap and trade, they've heard about border border adjustments, and they've heard about we have to restructure our energy sector. But they haven't really learned enough about the adaptation issues, what the economic risks are involved. So that's kind of one group that we're bringing in, even more meetings.
I think also these reports, you know, some of them get very redundant, but if you have different groups coming together and all of these groups are writing reports and agreeing essentially on the same thing, it's just building the momentum and the knowledge base for governments to tap into. So I think, you know, the plethora of reports and commissions is not necessarily a bad thing if it's pushing the needle a bit. I mean, I think the one actor in the food space and the agriculture space is the private sector. You know, the big ags, the food and beverage companies, they're really going to shift potentially, and even financially. I mean, Bill Gates has funded the CG system, but, you know, the bigger player in the agriculture and makers of food and beverages is the private sector. And, you know, Tanvi and I have talked about, you know, you can have a food company tinker a little bit and make a sustainable food product through reformulation, but if that's the same company that's then making all the bottled water in the world, taking a public good and making it private, and all the plastics, sort of cancels out that one thing they're doing. So I think the private sector needs to take a look at their whole portfolio, as opposed to just, you know, these kind of corporate social responsibility type little investments. And that's the most contentious actor in the nutrition and food space, but has the biggest reach, the biggest scale, the biggest impact. And we're just in the food area, maybe it's different in other sectors, but they're not coming on board enough yet, where they're really looking at both, you know, or triple wins of health, sustainability, and their profit. Right? Where can they have those triple wins? And we're not really seeing a big commitment, particularly on the health side. So to me, the private sector is the big actor that people just don't. In the food space, we're not talking enough with them on what to do. They're often excluded on these commissions because people consider it a conflict of interest to work with them. So they're really not sitting at some of the most important tables in these dialogues. You'll see a lot of academics, you'll see, you know, NGOs, but you don't see the private sector really coming to the table enough.
I think just to add quickly to what you both said, I think just like you said, there need to be a lot of different kinds of actors coming together. I'm certainly a different kind of actor that wasn't working in this space before. And I think that when it comes to, like you said, the reports, if you have different kinds of reports, the reports we put out really have to do with the human cost and the human, individual issues that are faced by people that really are affected by climate change. And so I think that also for the activism itself, you can have climate change activists, but you can also have other kinds of activists that are all working together on different sets of issues, but they all relate to what we're talking about. And so I think that that's helpful. And then finally, I think that, I don't think it's a good thing that there's high costs with climate change, both human costs and otherwise, but I think that that is certainly what we've seen in terms of various governments that might be resistant to making changes and making policies and building infrastructure that really deals with this well, is that when they really see how much, when they do have a problem and crisis, and the report that you guys, some of you have, is the most recent report that we put out related to climate change at all, and that was with the cyclones in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, well, and Malawi and other spots. But Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth that really decimated a lot of what was in Mozambique and had people moving and had infrastructure destroyed and had lost a lot of agricultural productivity. And so I think that when those things happen and when they happen in an unprecedented fashion, that that cost, both in terms of human migration and also other costs, really wake people up. And that's what I've seen.
Thank you. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. We have a mic going around, and just introduce yourself right here in the middle.
Hi, my name's Jake Stockman. I'm a second-year student here. I have two closely related questions that I'd like to address to Devin. What has been the main obstacle to establishing a legal status for climate-related refugees? And on a similar note, has any country unilaterally proposed anything that could be a model for something like that in the future?
So I think the biggest obstacle is really who and basically what kind of organization would really take responsibility. Because certainly the UN Agency for Refugees, UNHCR, years ago took on the mantle of internally displaced people, which it can't really manage already. I think the shrinking asylum space worldwide is a real challenge for, again, refugees themselves. And so I think the biggest obstacle is really determining what would that international mechanism be and who would be responsible. Because internationally and in these conventions and things, there's always agencies that are responsible and have the mantle to take that on. And I just think that that's my view, and certainly what I've seen in terms of people having discussions about this. As to your second question, which was,
Have any countries taken the lead?
Yeah. So I don't think so, but certainly there's been a lot. I mean, even since I was in grad school, like 15 years ago, I don't know why I'm aging myself, but but even since I was in grad school, where I focused really on forced migration, this was a discussion. Like, what is the model to expand this definition or to create a legal mechanism that really protects people displaced by climate? But it's been talked about for a long time in terms of action. I don't think any country has taken unilateral decisions on this, but certainly there are various countries that have dealt with major migration due to climate more than others, and those countries are working with neighboring countries as well. I know New Zealand, I just saw, has something to assist and people displaced by climate in islands nearby. So I think that regionally there's some action on these things, and there's I think when it comes to protection of displaced people, generally speaking, there are other mechanisms that are created specifically for people for certain reasons. There's humanitarian visas that are created in certain countries. So there's a lot of different mechanisms by which there can be protection for people displaced by climate, but whether that is large scale and global, that is still in the process, really.
Okay. Let's take these two questions, and then we'll.
My name is Akshat Chaturvedi. I'm alumni from the school and I wear multiple hats, but my question is very simple to the panelist as well as the moderator. What do you see, how do you see the role of storytelling in educating not just our society, but also those middle-level policy makers, corporate leaders, social entrepreneurs, students, and most importantly, media, because the problem with our popular media, it doesn't make a story of increasing climate and disaster risk, but it jumps on whenever there's a disaster. So we are more still quite a, more very sensation driven. Like I've been working in disaster risk management and climate for 18 years. And even if I tell people that, look, I work in disaster risk management, they think that I'm actually the guy who jumps off the chopper when somebody's, drowning in the flood. Like that image has to change. What do you think storytelling can help, up to what extent, and how, so very specifically, how it can change the policy, not just the awareness generation, sensationalism, but how it can actually educate the policymakers? Thank you.
I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet and Emerald Planet TV, so I am part of the media. I'm glad to let you go first, because we are the positive media. We have a program that goes around to all 214 countries and territories, and it's about best practices. And so it's about the solutions. There's about 2,600 of them on our website. If you want to go there, everything we do is public domain. We give it away. But the question is, how do we bring all of this together? Carter, I think you worked with Betsy Otto. She was on my TV program just last night talking about the organization that you're with and the adaptation. But how do we bring all this in, and the private sector? I've been in the nonprofit realm for a number of years, but also we work very closely with the private sector. And my whole thing is, if we're not including the private sector, that is a conflict of interest. We have to change the paradigm, because every 1 gallon of Coca-Cola that's made, that's 1 less gallon of water. So we have to think about it as far as resources, and going back to Devin's point. But anyway, how do we integrate all this together so that we bring everybody to the table, everybody feels comfortable at being there, and then how they become part of the solutions? It's like the one that Betsy was talking about last night, Cool Food. You got 10 of the largest food processing and beverage companies in the planet as part of that, working with the nonprofit. So I think there's a willingness to be there, but how do we encourage that? And thank you for doing this. This is a great seminar.
And on top of that question, are there examples of companies that should be emulated and promoted and that people should know about? All right, let's take those 2 questions and then we can open it up again.
I mean, I have a very simple answer. I'd love to hear both. I mean, how do we change policymakers? How do we bring in the private sector? I think it's giving them the economic case if they don't act. I mean, governments respond to understanding if it's going to impact their economic growth. I think that is a really important case to make, and how it's going to impact each of their sectors, how it's going to impact the health sector, how it's going to impact the ag sector. And usually policymakers respond to that, and then they can weigh the trade-offs of what are they willing to invest in, what can't they invest in. So I think it's all about giving them the economic case and into the future, and then they then have to grapple with the trade-offs in their decisions. And the same with private sector. It's a business case for them. How do you put that nutrition and environment for the bottom billion together as a package for them to think as an economic case for them to potentially look at their business into the future. I think both respond kind of equally to the business model. Media, I don't know. I mean, I struggle a bit in my conversations with media. I was on the E-Lancet report, and there was a lot of media coverage of that, and anytime I would be in the media, I would get hate mail, and yeah, it was just. I mean, I think media it's really powerful, but it's also very challenging to communicate with media because they are looking for a certain storyline that resonates with their readership. And if you slightly don't have that exactly what they want, they either don't fully use what you've had a discussion with them about, or some accurately use it, some don't accurately use information. But I think there's also a real need for scientists we need to better learn to communicate with media. Some of us are awful at communicating with media. So I think it's not always their fault, it's that scientists' inability or lack of training in dealing with media too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that to kind of second your comments, I think that, like you said, the cost-benefit analysis and, knowing that you can get a 200% return on what you're investing in is really quite remarkable. I mean, you can't beat that with anything else. I think also related to, I focus more on the aftermath of disasters and different things that are, and displacement due to factors like climate change. And so there is more of that, not sensationalism necessarily, but kind of really, really heart-wrenching actually, and devastating stories and effects. But I think that one thing we haven't mentioned as much is not only the cost-benefit analysis and the economic impact, but really, politically, right? If there's a political impact, because there's a lot of people that don't have a lot of financial power or whatnot, but in places that do have functioning political systems and democracies and other things like that, there really is a strong ability for people that do hear these stories or are concerned about this to, in all sorts of different countries, to really pressure political leaders. And if political leaders are going to face some consequences, then there's often a lot of change. And so I've seen that in some places as well.
So I just want to talk about the media question, storytelling. I agree with you. It's impossible to, but you almost have to confront it head on. I mean, I think the system is set up for us to fail because we're not living, I'm a child of the 80s. God, I wish it was the 80s again. I never thought I would say that. But in the 80s, in the US at least, you had 3 channels. You turned the TV on and you got the news from 3 different channels. And now it's like a parallel universe, right? And so we're functioning in this kind of media universe and space where each narrative gets packaged for a particular audience. So you can pick and choose what you want to know. So in some ways, storytelling is irrelevant, but in another way, it's more important than ever. Mm-hmm. And I agree with Jess. If there's no economic cost, you're not going to get anybody's attention. But in the creative space, so outside of corporate, outside of policy, in the creative space where you have photojournalists and artists working on these issues, I actually think it's really important for public education, which can serve to counter these negative effects of media, right? So you have very famous artists who do works inspired by the climate crisis. They reach so many people in different ways and touch people. So and that has mental effects on people, right? And it's not something that as policy folks that we study or analyze, but I think as humans and as a species, I think it's really important to support that. And unsurprisingly, those are the stories and the pieces of work that are absolutely not funded. There's no money for that kind of thing. And I think that also people don't know that the stories they're being told are actually about climate change. So when you're seeing documentary work about the Rohingya or about isolated rural communities in Pakistan, those are all climate change stories, because those are people that are going to be worst affected. They're the ones that least kind of impact the problem. Those are all climate change stories, but we just don't couch them in that narrative. And so this is where I do think that the work of reports and commissions really does help to shape that, because then we just look at things differently. So that's my non-wonky analysis for you. So we have a few more minutes for some questions or comments. All right, we've got 3. Let's take these 3 all at once. So the woman in the back first, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Destan Aytekin. I work for Harvest Plus program. It's part of a CGR research program for agriculture for nutrition and health, hosted by International Food Policy Research Institute. My question was to Dr. Fanzo. Actually, Dr. Fanzo, you have stated that, like, together with the political commitment, creativity, and innovations, we can make the change happen when it comes to transforming the food systems. So I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a bit more on the global trends, the innovations that are promising to tackle climate change and transform the food systems accordingly. So thank you so much once more for the opportunity to get all the valuable perspectives. Thanks.
Great. All right, so hold that thought.
Hi, my name is Vincent Hu. I'm a first-year ERE student here at SAIS. And my question is also directed to Professor Fanzo. So considering the imminent threat of climate change and the role of agriculture industry in exacerbating the already grim prospect of achieving sustainability, what has been the responses from policymakers regarding these issues, and how much have they achieved, if any, in ameliorating this predicament of humanity? And finally, what political tools or policy do we have that are ambitious enough to achieve sustainability in the near future? Thank you.
Okay. There's one up here.
Hello, my name is Maria Naranjo. I'm a second year here at SAIS, and my question is for all of you, whoever wants to answer. We've been talking a lot about top-down solutions to climate change, and I often feel like when I talk to other people about climate change, they always have this like free rider mentality. So in your opinion, what is, as individuals, what is our role, and what kind of things can we do in our daily life to combat climate change?
All right. So let's start with this question first, since it's fresh. And what is our individual role, but maybe also responsibility? I don't know if that's what you meant too, but I often think of the word responsibility when I think of what my role is. But let's open it up. I think that could be any of you.
Here, I mean, the answer in the U.S. is to vote in different people in the government. No, I'm serious.
Yeah.
The single greatest thing an individual can do is change what our government policies are. So, I mean, there's things you can do at the local level. On adaptation, I would also say the community level is super important, because communities, particularly when it comes to agriculture, but not just, when it comes to flooding, when it comes to emergency procedures, et cetera, communities have to be engaged, and they have to figure out what they need, how to manage it, ideally even manage the resources. So I think there's an expression that all adaptation is local. Not all is, but a lot of it's local, and we certainly, through the Commission, are doing explicit work to what they call devolve funding down to local levels so that communities can have a bigger say. A little later, I think maybe go back to, on some of the other questions, but I would like to say one more thing about private sector. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to just say it right now? Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the
Might as
private
well.
sector, on the private sector, and it does link to food. Good news and bad news. Through the Commission, we've helped put together what's called the Coalition of Climate Resilient Investment, because the private sector knows money's needed, and it's not just for beverages, but it's for infrastructure and for financial services, et cetera. So this is again, it's a big group, a prominent group. That's the luxury we have. They manage $5 or $6 trillion. So the decisions that this group makes are really important. So what do they want? They want better quantification. They want to understand risk. They want methodologies to do risk appraisal. And they want to take the kind of cost-benefit analysis we've done and convert costs and benefits into cash flow. And sort of the public sector has an important role. It'll never happen in the private sector by itself. So there's the need for this kind of agreement, blended finance, public-private partnerships, et cetera. So that's the good news. The bad news is on the supply chains. It's really easy to say that supply chains are threatened by climate change. In fact, we originally were going to have a chapter on supply chains because climate change will threaten the supply of particularly the global corporations sourcing cotton in Egypt or, soya in Argentina, et cetera, or chocolate in Cote d'Ivoire or something. So what did we find? We find that there are a few corporations out there that are good citizens, the Pepsis, the Mars, who want to invest in local resilience because climate change will threaten their sourcing. But in most cases we found, no, they can still just switch where they source from. And so the company is currently buying in country A, will just go to country B. And if that doesn't work, or country C, or a different region within country A. So we found that the private sector wasn't yet a reliable partner. And so we actually didn't have a chapter on that because we didn't really have a good story to tell about why are a few companies good global citizens when most of them aren't. They have different alternatives for their bottom line.
Jess, do you want to respond to the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think global actions and what are policymakers doing. I think there's a lot happening now on the relationship with food and agriculture. I think people are deeply worried about the hunger numbers going up for the third year in a row after 15 years of hunger declining. So I think there's a great concern of that, and FAO really, the Food and Agriculture Organization, attributed that increase to climate and conflict. So, and there's a worry that with climate change, we're going to see these reversal in the progress made towards reducing undernutrition overall. So I think there's deep worries about those that are hungry, the poorest of the poor, the migration issues, and all of the issues that will come with that. But I think, we have the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework. Some people think they're too lofty, but they are in place. They give countries a beacon to decide which targets to focus on. Not every country is focusing on 17 SDGs, but almost every country is focusing on the climate SDG. And most poor and middle income countries are focusing on SDG 2, which is the hunger one, so that brings those two sustainable development goals together. The evidence base is growing around food and climate, which is really important for policymakers in this very difficult to navigate sphere of evidence of what works, what doesn't work, what are the impacts on land and agriculture for climate. And there's been so many articles that have come out in the last few years around food and climate. I mean, it's really, the amplification of evidence is just astounding. There's a couple of key moments coming up for commitments, both political commitments, but also financial commitments. There's the Tokyo Food and Nutrition Summit coming up. There's a couple of ocean summits coming up. So there's these key moments that we're going to be seeing around commitments. And when you leave the United States, and I was working at FAO last year, and you talk to all the member states, everyone is very on board with climate. It's the grand challenge of the current and future global architecture. The only country that really comes out looking not cooperative is the United States, and you'll often hear in UN meetings, U.S. delegates will say, well, we believe in climate change, we believe in the natural ebbs and flows that the climate is changing. We just don't believe it's human-induced. And politically, if you don't believe it's human-induced, that means you do not have to change human behavior, which is a problem. You can still drive your car, you can still drive, eat a hamburger every day. And I think it's the only country when you sit in the Committee on Food Security that has that line of argument. You will hear like Argentina say, well, we don't believe that red meat is bad for health and the environment. Argentina is a big producer of beef. So every country has their little nuances around the climate agenda of which evidence they decide to agree with or they say is not true. But to not think that we are in an Anthropocene and that much of this climate, this hockey stick, this movement of just increased temperatures, massive deforestation, all of these indicators that are just rapidly changing, that none of that is due to human activity. I think there's one country in the world that believes that, and that is it's a big problem. But I think when you step outside of the US borders, everyone's talking about climate, and countries are figuring out what they can do. But I completely agree with you. It's the private sector that is, it's not clear where they sit. And to me, it's the place where we need the most agreement. I mean, on the Eat Lancet Commission, the biggest issue was the diet. An individual can change their diet to more plant-based. The livestock industry was not happy about that recommendation and continue to not be happy that that message is being pushed by the media, that we need to decrease our consumption of cows. That is a direct threat to the economic livelihoods of the livestock sector. But it is a tangible thing that individuals can do. They can shift their diet to more lower environmental footprint. There's a great science article that came out a couple of years ago looking at what individuals can do and the impact they can make on climate. Diet was like the third thing you could do. Second was less international flights. The first, I'm looking at you.
Now you're putting us
The first
out of jobs.
is having less children. Every time you introduce a new person in the world, they produce a whole set of environmental footprints. And that's the most controversial one, is the fertility rate of the world. So yeah, Prius, recycling's like way down the list. But diet, international flights, and smaller families are the three biggest contributors an individual can make. Interestingly, there's some modeling that they did, but yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, the whole Beyond Burger is very fascinating to me because I did think of the people that benefit from selling beef. And if I were a policymaker, if I were in government, I would think, okay, what can I do? Or if I was a politician, I would say, what can I do to those people if they are my constituents? Is that if that industry falls within my jurisdiction, how do I actually help them transition through what we anticipate happening? And I hope that's happening at a local level. I don't see that conversation happening at the national level.
I mean, the Beyond Burger, the Impossible Burger, the jury's out, right? Healthy, no. Really processed food.
Right.
Environment,
Expensive.
yeah, more environmentally friendly than cows, but there's still a lot that needs to be done looking at the life cycle assessment of these alternative processed products. It's still out, the jury. But health-wise, not that healthy, the Impossible or the Beyond Burger.
All right, good to know.
So,
all right, well,
anyway.
I would like to thank our panelists and our hosts and the audience for your great questions. And am I to direct them somewhere, or would you like to turn it back to Sarah? Okay, thank you.
Thank you guys so much. That was really incredible. To Carter, Devin, Jess, and Shamila. We would like to welcome everybody now to the back of the auditorium. There is a reception with food and bev. And the 15 winning photographs from our photo competition are also on display. So hopefully some of the photographers are around. I know Logan's here. You can feel free to just ask them anything. So thank you so much for coming.